Shall I kick off? Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Leanne. I'm the Interagency PSEA Coordinator in the Asia Pacific region. I'm joined by my colleagues Irene, the GBV in Emergencies Advisor for the Asia Pacific. We've got Sarah Martin, Lucy Heaven-Taylor, Martina Brostrom. We've got Shamima from Cox's Bazar and Cherie from the Philippines, who will form our panel, and they will introduce themselves as we go. But this is a joint learning session by the Asia Pacific GBV and Emergencies Working Group and the Asia Pacific PSEA AAP Working Group and the Global GBV Area of Responsibility Community of Practice. So welcome. The session's being recorded, so if there's any issues with that, let us know. So just going to the outline, we've got the welcome and introduction. We will do a brief introduction for the colleagues because it's a joint session today on what we actually do. So the GBV Area of Responsibility Community of Practice, and then the AAP PSEA Working Group, and also the GBV and Emergencies Working Group. So you know exactly what we do. We will have then the presentation of the CHS Alliance report on the Victim Survivor Centred approach to protection from sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment in the aid sector. And then we'll go to, as I mentioned, colleagues from Bangladesh and the Philippines to share their experiences. Following that, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So please do put your questions in the chat when it comes to it. We won't have the poll, but we will always love your feedback, and you can do that in writing afterwards. So to kick off, just for those of you who don't know, we do have a regional working group for accountability to affected people or community engagement and protection from sexual exploitation and abuse at the regional level. So it's comprised of AAP and PSEA coordinators, co-chairs, regional and country level safeguarding and PSEA focal points, and also AAP focal points. It's at the moment it's co-chaired by the World Food Programme, UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the UN Development Coordination Office. And we have technical co-leads from the NGO sector, and we're looking forward to that collaboration as we go. We have quarterly meetings and regular webinars such as this one, experience sharing, informal exchanges, and provide technical support. So if you want to find out more about the working group, please go to our Relief webpage, and you are free to email me to join, and we are very open with our membership. And with that, over to you, Irene, to give us a brief intro into the GBV and Emergencies Working Group.
Thanks, Leanne. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this joint learning session. Again, I'm Irene Quizon. I'm the RIGA, so Regional Emergency GBV Advisor for Asia Pacific. So we have also the Asia Pacific Gender-Based Violence in Emergency Working Group. So it's an interagency working group dedicated to build capacity and technical expertise on GBV in emergency in Asia Pacific region. It is chaired by UNFPA as the cluster lead agency for gender-based violence, supported by the RIGA. And membership includes all regional actors focus on GBV risk mitigation, response, including preparedness and recovery. We do have quarterly meetings, monthly webinars such as this one, provide technical support, advocacy briefs, experience sharing, etc. So for any queries around the working group, you can please contact me or Sujata. I know she was meant to join this webinar. I don't think she's online, but thank you. But you can also visit our GBV AoR website. I've also included that. So I'll stop here and give the floor over. Oh, okay, Sujata is here. Hi, Sujata. Thank you so much. So Sujata is our chair for the WG. So I'll give the floor to Sarah Martin.
Hi, everyone. 4 years of using Zoom, and I still forget to unmute myself. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Sarah Martin. I'm one of 2 coordinators, facilitators of the GBV AoR Global Community of Practice. We are a membership group of over 1,000 GBV specialists around the world, and we're part of the GBV AoR through the Global Protection Cluster. We were invited by Irene and Leon to join you today to spread the good word about the community of practice and invite you to join us as well. So I just want to take a few minutes of this valuable time to tell you a little bit about the COP. So first of all, we're a virtual platform for members to learn and share. We offer webinars, we have some training courses, and most importantly, we offer peer-to-peer support for GBV specialists globally. Membership is by application, and you apply as an individual, not through your organization. So anyone who is working in GBV is welcome to join us. I'll put the information on how to join in the chat, and we'll follow up and send you a message afterwards as well. Have the next slide, please. We're one of 2 services that the Global GBV AoR offers. The other is our sister organization, the GBV AoR Help Desk, which is a free bespoke advice hotline where you can write to them and get information and rapid technical advice and support. Again, it's free of charge. They provide a number of different services like producing global literature and evidence reviews, evidence digest and guidance notes, or connecting you directly with a GBV specialist so that you can talk through what your problem is and provide some support. Next slide. So here I think we went too far in advance. There's one before that, please. Okay, let's try before that. It looks like one's missing. Anyway, doesn't matter. I just wanted to point out that we have a number of members in the Asia Pacific region in the GBV AoR community practice. And we wanted to reach out because we feel like there's so much interesting things happening in the Asia Pacific region that we could learn from around the world in our other responses. So we wanted to encourage members in Asia to join us in the community of practice and to share the work that you're doing, the different contexts that you work in. I know, for instance, there's a lot of work on disaster preparedness and disaster response in the Asia region, as well as work on trafficking and a number of other things. So we're quite keen to beef up our membership in Asia. And with that note, I'll put some information in the chat on how you can join us, and I turn it back over to our great co-hosts. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Irene, for those introductions. So we just wanted to set the scene for everybody and make sure that we know what we're talking about. So this is a webinar which brings together concepts of sexual exploitation and abuse and gender-based violence. So we'll talk a bit about the intersection, but first things first is to make sure we have the groundwork understood. So just to define sexual exploitation and abuse, so although it happens anywhere in society, when it's used as an umbrella term within the sector, the term refers to sexual exploitation and abuse perpetrated by those working in the aid sector, so humanitarian development or peace contexts. Whereas gender-based violence is an umbrella term for any harmful act that's perpetrated against a person's will and that's based on socially ascribed, for example, gender differences between men and women. So it includes acts that inflict physical, sexual, or mental harm or suffering, threats of such acts, coercion, and other deprivations of liberty. And these acts can occur in public or in private, and GBV can occur anywhere. So when we look at the definitions of sexual exploitation and abuse, just to unpack a bit sexual exploitation, you have the definition there, but in plain English, it really is taking advantage of somebody else, abusing your position of power, and in exchange, you get a sexual favor. And the other person who provides that sexual favor gets, in general, some sort of benefit. For example, it could be cash, money, or services. Whereas sexual abuse is more this a more straightforward criminal law definition when we're talking about the actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, and that's perpetrated by an aid worker against somebody they're supposed to be supporting. So sexual exploitation and abuse are considered misconduct, and if perpetrated by an aid worker against somebody in the community that is receiving aid, then this does constitute an egregious breach of trust. So we have the distinctions here between SEAH, sexual exploitation and abuse, and GBV. So just to make sure we do understand, SEAH is driven by different forms of abuse, of power and inequalities. So we're talking about structural inequalities here, which are linked to gender, race, ethnicity, disability, status, gender identity, sexual orientation, class, and caste. We are also talking about hierarchies within organisations. So, for example, between senior and junior staff. And then there are also situational factors. So for gender-based violence, we are always talking about this being based on gender inequality and socially ascribed differences between men and women. So being targeted for GBV can be exacerbated further when an individual faces multiple forms of inequality. And as SEAH is most often perpetrated against women and girls, it is most often a form of GBV. All right, so just to clarify those things, we just wanted to set the scene here, and then, to really get ourselves thinking about that. So GBV is a form of structural inequality, which usually results from men's abuse of power or dominance over women. So with that, Sarah, I'm seeing your misplaced slide, which has appeared in the middle here, but let's just skip over that. And we'll go now to Martina and Lucy.
Thanks so much, Leanne. And I'll just take a minute to introduce myself. My name is Martina Brostrom, and I'm working for the CHS Alliance, where I am leading a project on an accountability project on developing victim-centered approaches to PSEAH. We in CHS Alliance use the H, but in this webinar, we will be using PSEA and PSEAH synonymously. And it's a project that's funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. And today, my colleagues, Lucy Heaven-Taylor, whom I worked on this project, and also Shamima from Bangladesh, we will tag team and try to share a little bit about where we are at when it comes to implementing victim-centered approaches. I won't preclude what my colleague Lucy will be saying, but just to mention sort of from the onset that victim-centered approaches is nothing new. It has been meaningfully used within many sectors in the past, within the police force, within GBV, safeguarding, psychology, within the justice system. And so we really, it's just a new area of work for us that works on PSEAH. But it is a department from business as usual, and that's why we have been rolling out this pilot project. So the project really focuses on listening to victims and survivors and developing accountability mechanisms that work for them. And it's a project that's being implemented in 3 humanitarian settings across Palestine, in the Amara region of Ethiopia, and in Cox's Bazar, in the Rohingya camps of Cox's Bazar of Bangladesh. And the reason why we have invested ourselves in this project is because we really felt that there needed to be a new way forward for how we can improve outcomes for victims and survivors. In the past, a lot of work of PSEAH has very much been about compliance and about institutional outcomes. We have done quite well when it comes to putting in place policies, codes of conducts, managing more stringent recruitment processes. But the persons and the people who have been affected by the violence and been victimized have been very peripheral to all of this. And that's really where we're changing things and trying to put the individuals been harmed in the focus and making sure that the approaches when it comes to reporting PSEAH are accessible and acceptable to those communities where our aid is being delivered. And so just to say as well, perhaps before I move on to speak a little bit about my own story, is that in this work we have really focused, as I said, about the survivor's journey. And in a moment I will actually use my own journey to illustrate how things can go terribly wrong if you aren't attentive to the needs, the agency, the respect, and justice rights of the survivor. And so that is just to put an incentive there to say that there is everything to be won by everybody through a victim-centered approach. And so when we apply the victim-centered approach, the outcomes for people will be better. Perpetrators can be held to account. There is a prevention dividend there because we can stop incidences if people trust and use our mechanisms for reporting. And investigations are strong and improve, substantiate the allegations, and then that those victims can see through to their address. And really, perhaps most fundamentally, I think if we can have a more victim-centered approach that is more aligned with the survivor journey and have more sensitive to what it is that the person has to go through to have that redress, and that we understand the various stages the person passes through after having been harmed, that then also we can improve the process, and we can perhaps also improve the community and trust, not only by the people that are harmed, but the communities who are at risk for being sexually harassed, exploited, and abused. And finally, as well, it's also a donor incentive, because of course our aid is there to be accountable aid and to make sure that we don't do harm. But before my colleague Lucy speaks, I'm also to share then a little bit of my own story, because I'm myself a survivor of sexual assault. And it was a PSEA case, an SEAH case, because I was working in a UN organization at the time. As it so happens, the sexual assault happened at a Bangkok hotel. It was at the context of a workshop, and it happened in an elevator at the Dusitani Hotel. I'm sure those of you who work in the region know it well. It's a center for a lot of workshops. And so it was a meeting that brought together a series of country directors from across the globe. And there was a reception at the evening, after which I was asked to work with the deputy executive director of that organization to prepare his talking points for the following day when the actual meeting started. And what happened was we went to work on this presentation. It was in a public space, but I was sexually assaulted on the elevator down. You can imagine the scene. It came totally unexpected. It's true that he was sort of a bit known in the organization. He was a sexual harasser, had harassed me, many other women. He was a type of man that you stayed away from. And nevertheless, I was caught off guard, and having had a background in GBV myself, you think that you can read cues, but it's just to say that, it's never the survivor's fault of what happens. And very often, I think that what we do wrong in our prevention is that we don't understand how these perpetrators sometimes can be very charming to those around us, how they really work on that, whether it's with women or with children or with other men. They really have their way. They spend a lot of time grooming up their persona so that when that report happens, that they can say that absolutely not, and I'm not that. I love women. I'm so respectful, and of course that happened to me as well. But going back in time, then after the assault, it was a really shocking experience, and it took a lot of time to land in the shock after. I needed comfort, so I immediately called a friend who was not at the meeting. I called my mother, and and during the event, I just put the mask on, and I continued with a 5-day event. When I returned home, I confided I was very afraid to report it. So even though I had disclosed it, I was afraid to report it through the channels. It was because I had worked at that point, I think 10 years in the organization, and I knew that the organization was quite lax when it comes to applying its own rules. It was also before, it was the UNAIDS, so it was an organization that focused on HIV and AIDS, and it didn't maybe have very developed framework for reporting. There was no hotline, there was no real procedures in place. There was some policies, but they weren't necessarily acted upon. And because I had worked quite close to management, I knew that this particular man, who I said was known in the organization as more than a womanizer, a harasser, people had turned a blind eye to that for decades, that he had worked there. And so for all the right reasons in my risk calculus at the time, I was kind of terrified of reporting it. So I did report it to my government, and they did log my case there. And telling somebody in real time about it turned out to be really helpful in my case. And of course, I had sworn at the time those that I confided in what had happened to me, I'd sworn them to silence, and I wanted really a sense of control. And it was really important for me to have my agency to be able to report it when I was ready, and not just because they thought that it was the right thing to do. Finally, what happened was that the dynamics in the office, even though it was a big organization, I was based in headquarters at the time, became very awkward. And I met with the ombudsman, there was no support services, but what sparked me kind of reaching out to the ombudsman was that I was facing really gruesome retaliation at the time. It became very clear that, you know, this man who was number 2 of the organization was going to do everything to get me out of there. Because since he had tried to reproach after and sort of smoothen over his what he had done, when he realized that I was totally closed off to any kind of liaison, to any kind of conversation, anything, that then I became a sort of risk to him that he had to manage. So he tried really his hardest to make me want to leave and to make me to leave. That was blocking my work. That was talking badly about me, spreading rumors, not approving my duty travels, not clearing my work, etc., etc. And because he was a number 2, he had a lot of people that were under him, and that make it really, really difficult, which sort of spiraled me into a sick leave eventually. But what happened was that I decided to go forward with a formal report, because I did come to that point where it wasn't possible to resolve this through mediation, through the ombudsman or anything as such. So a formal report was made, and that then itself started an investigation. But prior to me having launched the investigation, having sort of requested the investigation straight from WHO, as it was at the time, was because the executive director had actually approached me with a job offer. So I realized that the organization wasn't going to take it seriously, and I was really wanting my accountability. I wanted what happened to me not to happen to other women in the organization. And I, as I said, like others, had been part of that culture where everybody had turned a blind eye to what we thought was harassment. But I now realize that there was a sex offender among us, and I think a huge responsibility also to make sure that the organization knew how dangerous was this man, to protect him. So I wanted the retaliation to stop. I wanted him not to harm others. And I wanted the organization that I worked for 10 years to sort of back me up and hold him accountable. But instead, as I said, the executive director tried to approach me with a very glamorous job offer in a desirable duty station. And it did not work. And I should just pause here and say that I'm a Swedish woman, had worked 10 years in the organization, was relatively senior at the time, and with all the privilege that came with my position and my nationality. So one can imagine it's not always easy to make those choices, and it's something we have to be attentive to, how we try to buy off the silence. What happened was that I decided to go ahead with a formal written complaint. And it's also a note in time is that before it was into writing, the organization could kind of fumble with it. But when it came very formal and I went to see also the lead investigator, had to be very intentional about getting my kind of case on the move. And then it started, and that was 14 months of hell, because during this time, gossip started, retaliation grew intensive, increasingly more intensive, and I fell ill. It was very difficult to recount what was happening. And I had the feeling very, very often as I was going through it, was new to me at the time. I never lived through an investigation, that it didn't feel right. And I certainly realized that things were not right when I finally got the investigation report that that unsubstantiated my allegations, but with the remark that his sexual harassment has to stop. And actually, I was very much reproached in the investigation report, because I was told that I had made a big mistakes and been terribly loyal, I'm paraphrasing, but that I had not followed procedures by notifying my government about what had happened to me. And so that then, well, in lack of a better word, sort of blacklisted me within the organization. What then happened was that the report got leaked. Oh, I should say as well, the way I found out the result of the results of this investigation, where I was left unaccompanied for 16 months, I think it was through a press release that the organization was very keen to put up, and they had sort of paraphrased it a bit. So it wasn't even that it was unsubstantiated, which would mean that they had, well, Lucy will speak about this, but basically that the burden of proof, which they used beyond reasonable doubt, which I'm hoping Lucy can also pick on, that was a very high evidential threshold for investigation. But what it basically landed was that they transformed that into him being not guilty. So that was a huge blow. And to receive that when you're sitting in front of your office computer in the office, just going to the bathroom, I remember meeting several colleagues, and they just kind of glared at me as if I had like sort of concocted this entire story, which obviously had been a deep personal trauma I'd lived through several years at that time, because the process was so long. Anyway, what happened was that the report got leaked, and women's organization from across the world came out sort of rallying for support. And it happened that the Me Too coincided at the same time. So there was really this sense of speaking up. When I had started my process, I felt very lonely. There was no real solidarity from the sort of women's community or from within the community. And the organization I worked, a lot of us was professional, working on sexual and reproductive health and rights. But I have to say that there was very little support. And all of a sudden, when the things went public, I just had this sense of solidarity and support. It was really important because it helped you really, it helped you not, not feel guilty about what you've done, that you've made mistakes, and reporting it. You kind of start the process thinking that naively that it would lead to some kind of accountability and the justice. And then, of course, when you're being branded a liar and you're going through something extremely painful like that, and you're sort of dealing with the trauma and you're managing your household at home, and then you're trying to go to work and be professional, and you feel like you're breaking inside, it's obviously a very, very difficult process. And then you have your colleagues coming and sort of glaring at you. So that was an extremely difficult process for me. But then all of a sudden finding this solidarity in the women's movement from across the world, that you're just saying, analyzing the investigation report, taking it apart and saying that shouldn't happen. And of course, what happened as well was that other women who had actually been within the organization and also within that had been victim of the same perpetrator, they also denounced him and spoke up. And that then together, I think that there was this recognition that it wasn't just a he says versus she says, but that there was a real institutional problem there. And I think it's very often the case. Organizations are very keen to reduce it to one single perpetrator that's accountable and one single victim in a particular circumstance. But that's, of course, is not the case. These perpetrators, they are recruited, they're deployed, they are continuing to be employed, they continue their behavior within the organizations where they work, unrestricted and unaccounted for. And very often, I think it's that very the power that comes with that position and with that role that actually puts them in the confidence to be able to commit this kind of atrocities. Anyways, this recognition that it wasn't just about my case, but maybe there was an institutional problem there, led a number of different governments actually to call for an institutional review of the organization where I worked. And after, I think 5 or 6 months of review, it was put together by an independent commission, including human rights lawyers, managers, and civil society representatives. They then concluded that the organization was a toxic workplace, that sexual abuse and harassment was rife, and that they didn't have any mechanisms in place, not when it comes to PSEAH, but also not oversight mechanisms for those in management. And he recommended that the whole management team goes. And parallel to this, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres decided to reopen the case in view of the many testimonies that had followed and the poor investigation process that had happened. And so that then ran for another, I think, a year and a bit. And that actually substantiated my allegations. So that felt like a very long way to accountability. It wasn't necessarily accountability because, as in so many other cases, the perpetrator had already left at that point. I had been long fired because in the middle of all of these things, the retaliation took such a turn that they decided to, after the public attention, that I would become they spanned the narrative in such a way that I was recast in the role from survivor to perpetrator. So they mounted a false dossier against me and then ousted me from the organization while I was on medical leave. And of course, it was very difficult at the time. Reflecting back, there were certainly moments that I regretted having reported it, but overall, I think it was important that I did. The organization has still not recovered. The public sort of scrutiny that followed, the lack of funding that was impacting them while they were doing the consistently wrong thing, the reputational kind of damage it had to take. It was quite something. And so several people left. In the end, it was a cleared house. I was fired. The perpetrator left on his retirement. He was not fired. He left with his golden handcuffs. But the executive director was forced out following this review, and they constituted a new senior management team, even though many people remained. And of course, many of the challenges, the boys' club, they were dispersed, not broken up, I'd say. And the outcome was that an apology letter several years later after they'd sat on the report, and I had to litigate actually to be able to have access to the report. So all of this to say that things could have been so different, I think, had my organization taken a victim-centered approach, had they offered me some compassion when I reported it, had I been accompanied through the process, had I been believed in what I was reporting, had they had put their sort of compassion at the forefront so that they could have, had they been attentive to the retaliation that I suffered, had they had a better investigative process that had a lower threshold, that was more correct, and had there been support services, so I didn't have to wait for them to come to me, but they could have been purposefully there to support me through this, and had there been accountability, so my perpetrator could have been, at the time, been fired and held to accountable. And I then could have used that timely case to maybe pursue criminal accountability through the national court. I think my experience would have been quite different. And with that, I want to thank you for listening and pass over to Lucy Heaven-Taylor, who will speak a little bit about what we feel is a much better approach than, sadly, what I and so many with me have to go through when something like this happens to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. I want to take a moment here just to reflect on Martina's story and to thank you once again, Martina. I've heard Martina's story before, but it never diminishes in how shocking it is. I'm sure many of us have either experienced ourselves or know people who've experienced sexual harassment, exploitation, or abuse. And so just to take a moment to reflect on that. And if anyone has found anything that Martina spoke about distressing, please do feel free to reach out to the panel separately. So thank you, Martina. My name's Lucy Heaven-Taylor. I'm a safeguarding and PSEA consultant. I've been working on these issues for over 20 years now. I've supported various UN agencies, NGOs and governments on PSEA. I'm also an investigator, so I investigate reports of SEA and I also train others to do so. Amongst other things, I'm involved in the CHS Alliance IQTS Investigator Qualification Training Scheme that some of you might be aware of. So when Martina invited me to work with her on this project, after, as I said, about 20 years since I did my first investigation, I have seen it all. I've seen it done wrong on so many occasions. So this was a great opportunity for us to try and put this right and to come up with a way to do this better so that nobody has to experience what Martina went through and what hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other people have been through as well. So what this project did, as Martina mentioned, it's based on research in those 3 locations, Cox's Bazar, Ethiopia and OPT. With the project, we came up with a paper and a series of recommendations. They are just recommendations, so I'm going to talk you through what we've come up with so far based on the research. It's very much a starting point. What we think the recommendations might be based on what we've learned and been told from this project, but of course we welcome input. So actually, if we could just pop back to the previous slide very briefly. You'll see that this is a victim survivor journey in the graphic. What we wanted to do in this report was to approach it from the perspective of the victim survivor and the journey that they take through all of these processes, whilst acknowledging, of course, that every victim survivor's journey is different. They don't necessarily follow a linear time frame, an easy one like we see in this picture, but everyone's experience is different. But what we wanted to do is to take some of the key points at which victim survivors interact with our organisation and what we should be doing at each of those points to get this right. So if we could go to the next slide. First of all, in our survivor journey, of course, we have the harassment, exploitation or abuse itself. And for this part of our presentation, Martina has already told you a little bit about her experience and what it feels like to come into contact with your organisation when you've experienced this. So on the next step of the journey, if we could go to the next slide, as I said, we've organised this in a linear fashion. It doesn't always represent how victim survivors experience it. But for the purposes of the paper and the presentation, this is how we'll look at it. So first of all, if a victim survivor chooses to do so, they may disclose to our organisation that they've experienced SEA. Our recommendations for good practice at this stage of the journey is, first of all, that organisations are prepared to receive disclosures. I'll talk in a minute about community-based reporting mechanisms, but our experience shows that victim survivors may report to anyone at any point in the organisation. They may not report to you as PSEA or GBV colleagues. They may just report to somebody they work closely with, they've seen and they trust in the organisation. So it's very important that everyone in the organisation is at a minimum prepared, knows what to do if somebody discloses SEA to them. So we recommend a basic training for all staff who come into contact with members of the community and preferably the whole workplace on how to receive a disclosure in a way that doesn't re-traumatise the person making the disclosure. that they then know immediately what to do with that information, that they know who to refer it to within their organisation for follow-up, and that needs to be done confidentially. So we're not asking staff to deal with the disclosure, but simply that they know who to refer it to. That we don't influence or pressure victim survivors to disclose or to give us further information. We also found that people we spoke to preferred an external quality assured third-party mechanism to deal with those disclosures. Now, not all of our organisations, of course, have the resources to do that. Not all external third-party mechanisms might necessarily be fit for purpose. But the important thing is the transparency and the separation. So there is a separate body of people who are on hand to handle disclosures. Next slide, please. So I mentioned reporting mechanisms. That's something that we focus a lot on in our work, not just on SEA, but in accountability generally. However, in the report, we recommend that whilst reporting mechanisms are still important, that we don't place the burden of reporting SEAH to people who are experiencing it. So we're not waiting for victim survivors to come forward and report through one of our formalised reporting mechanisms, but rather we're being proactive both in our prevention and ready to receive disclosures, as I mentioned in the previous slide. When we spoke about how people prefer to report SEA, we found that most of them prefer to report through a trusted intermediary. So that we recognise that that's a very common way that people report, not necessarily through an anonymised telephone hotline or email address, although those both have their importance as well. But it tends to be more of a personal interaction that people prefer. If we do have reporting channels in place, of course, they should be designed in consultation with different groups in the communities and be safe, accessible, appropriate and confidential. Next slide, please. So when the report comes into the organisation, we recommend that reports handling and case management systems are designed together with at-risk groups, people that might be reporting in, so that we know that they are safe and appropriate. And of course, in this case handling, and in fact the whole process that we're speaking about, the victims and survivors, of course, are treated as experts in their situation. In reports handling, we found that the recommendation was that organisations should allow anonymous reports. There's always a concern that these reports will be malicious, but also anonymous reports sometimes are genuine reports, and it's important that we don't close ourselves off to learning about misconduct and SEA by our staff by not allowing anonymous reports, and that those reports should have no statute of limitations. That means that you can report historical harassment, exploitation or abuse, no matter how long ago it took place, and the organisation should follow up on it. It also recommends, of course, that victims and survivors should receive support at their pace and for as long as needed. We know already, those of us who practice a victim survivor centred approach, that we offer support to survivors as soon as we hear about an incident, should they wish to take it up, and that we're proactive enabling them to do so. But also, as mentioned, a survivor's journey is not always brief or linear. So we should be prepared to offer that support for whenever they need it, and perhaps to go, one good way I heard it termed was that we go hand in hand with the survivor on their journey. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned referral to support services. As I said, the good practice here is that whenever we hear about a report, before we've even undertaken an investigation, any internal process to determine whether our staff member was the perpetrator, we should nonetheless be proactively assisting our victim survivor to access services. And this is particularly where we can work together between PSEA colleagues and GBV colleagues, because GBV colleagues are usually are familiar with support services in a location. We recommend that support services are mapped to ensure that they are appropriate, they're safe, that they are appropriate to local context and custom, and also that they are accessible as well for everyone who wishes to access them. And generally, for the PSEA people out there, your GBV colleagues will know all of that. They'll have undertaken that mapping. And if you do get a report of SEA, they are a good resource to go to help you to enable your survivor to assist services, to access services. I've mentioned that we are providing support if the survivor wishes to access it. The exception to this, of course, is that cases involving children under 18, we would always refer them as appropriate when it is safe to do so, because we are acting in the best interests of the child. Next slide, please. So investigation, another big area of practice, quite often a sticking point, something that our organisations worry about and feel that they need to improve their practice on. But the first question we say to ask is, do we actually require an investigation for action? Do we have enough information to proceed already? Are there ways in which we can circumnavigate an investigation in order to make decisions? If we do investigate, of course, we are always looking for consent from the victim survivor based on an informed choice as to whether we follow up on their disclosure or report of sexual exploitation and abuse. Again, the exception is if we learn about SEA of a child under 18, then we will act in the best interests of the child and refer that as necessary. If an investigation does take place, we recommend that investigators are trained, that they're experienced in survivor-centred approaches and a trauma-focused approach, and that they use safe and appropriate investigation protocols. That the investigation is trauma-informed, transparent and impartial. Now, Martina touched on this next point earlier, balance of probability. So this is about the threshold of evidence in order to uphold a report or an allegation of SEA made against a staff member. What balance of probability means is that we will uphold this allegation against the staff member if we find that the allegation is more likely than not to have happened. Sometimes organisations have beyond reasonable doubt or similarly high thresholds of evidence. This makes it very difficult to take forward allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse, where, of course, generally speaking, there are no witnesses to the exploitation or abuse that took place. However, for a workplace investigation into staff misconduct, most labour law allows balance of probability as that evidentiary threshold, and that's what we recommend that people use. We also recommend that throughout the investigation, victims and survivors are accompanied by a support person who will act in their best interests and act as their champion throughout that process. Next slide, please. So the next slide is organisational decision making. Now, when we do our research, and also from my experience in my practice, this is where everything tends to fall down. As Martina mentioned, there can be many policies, many procedures in place, but when the organisation has to make a difficult decision that concerns their own staff and misconduct, this tends to be where we most often see that policies are very poorly followed. So we recommend, it sounds obvious, but as we've seen, not always the case, decisions are made in the best interests of the victim and survivor rather than the organisation. We recommend that disciplinary outcomes for perpetrators are consistent. Something I've seen quite often is that a staff member in one location might be dismissed for a type of sexual exploitation or abuse misconduct that in another location there's a different disciplinary measures are applied. Maybe they're moved to a different post or allowed to resign, but this should be consistent. We also recommend that anonymised data on cases and the outcomes are shared. So many of your organisations do share anonymous data on cases in the public domain. We recommend that that includes what the outcomes of those cases were. in order that we can really analyse what trends are, and we can also analyse if disciplinary measures are being consistently applied. And of course, we recommend that whistleblowers are not retaliated against. We heard from Martina just example after example after example of how she was retaliated against for reporting SEA. There should be no retaliation for exposing SEA cases or for reporting malpractice or negligence in dealing with SEA cases. Next slide, please. So the next slide is the final part of our report, but the one where we undertook our research, that we found there was much less that we could find about good practice in this area, and that's redress and compensation. It's very rare that you can find organisations where we consider that there's been appropriate redress and compensation. Martina mentions that many elements of her identity, intersecting elements of her identity, including her nationality of Swedish, meant that compared to many victims and survivors, she was more in a position of power to try and bring about redress and compensation, even though it took her many, many years and was a very traumatic experience. Think of those who may find themselves in position of less power. We saw in recent years the widespread sexual exploitation and abuse in the response to Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that many of you may be aware of, that was perpetrated by staff of UN agencies, including but not limited to WHO. The women who were survivors of that sexual exploitation and abuse received compensation of $500 each, which I'm sure we all agree is an insult compared to what it was that they experienced, and probably widely disparate when compared with compensation that might be afforded to more powerful members of staff who were able to follow up and to litigate. We recommend that victim survivors' wishes for redress, of course, are respected, that where the sexual exploitation, abuse or harassment is a criminal act, that legal aid is facilitated for the victim or survivor to pursue legal recourse. And this final point, in our research, we found that most, probably all organisations have some sort of mechanism for compensation for other kinds of harm. For example, if your staff member knocks over and maybe injures or kills a member of the community when they're driving an organisation's vehicle, it is likely that compensation may be paid to the family. We recommend that organisations leverage existing compensation policies for harms that include sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment for victims and survivors. Next slide, please. So that was a brief tour through our recommendations. As I said, this is a foundational paper. As we speak, the project is continuing in testing these recommendations in the 3 locations that we referenced at the beginning of the presentation. And we're going to be hearing more about that from the other speakers. But again, to say that, of course, we're very much interested in your feedback. But that's all from me. So I will be handing over to the next presenter. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lucy, for that and running us through the foundational paper, which is it's really very valued. I've looked through the paper, but to hear you present it is a lot more enriching, and I think it really helps the understanding. So to take us through to the next content in this webinar, we wanted to hear to sort of ground the theory and to look at some case studies and experiences from country context. So we have Shamima on the line from Bangladesh. If you would like to come in, thanks. Shamima, are you with us? Or in the interest of time, we might turn to Cherie. If you're on the line, we might hear from you first while we wait for Shamima to come. Cherie, if you're on the
Yes.
line, hi, welcome.
Yes.
Please
Can you
do
hear me?
introduce yourself. Yes.
All right. Thanks, Leanne. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Sherry Herrera de Vinegracia. I'm the UN Interagency PSEA Coordinator. I'm sitting at the Resident Coordinator's Office. I used to be the Child Protection Officer in Emergencies and PSEA Officer of UNICEF from 2022 and 2023. But before that, I acted as GBV and Child Protection Humanitarian Coordinator for UNFPA and UNICEF Philippines. I also served as one of the grantees of ELRA in their GBVIE Innovation Grant in 2019, wherein we assessed the impact of GBVIE programming using creative tools. And the Philippines has an active national PSEA network, and we recently reactivated the sub-national PSEA network. So let me start by giving an overview of the country's setup on GBV, which includes sexual exploitation and abuse and child protection. So the Philippines is a very solid and strong legal framework. It has laws that led to various protocols, structures, and mechanisms at the national and local levels. And the term we use is actually victim survivor. It has put in place a referral system that promotes a multidisciplinary team approach at the provincial, municipal, and city levels. It is supported by the establishment of national and local hotlines or helplines managed by the government and private sector. And the help desks are also established at the barangay or village level. So the multidisciplinary team, which is composed of the social worker, a female police officer, a doctor, and a legal officer, is operationalized through the application of the one-stop shop in the delivery of services needed by the victim survivor. And this is being practiced to avoid re-traumatization of the victim survivor whenever she's being interviewed. At the local level, we also provide financial assistance to support the victim survivor throughout the process. This is the setup in normal times, but whenever the country is stricken by a disaster or armed conflict, part of the role of the GBV subcluster and the Child Protection Working Group is to support the local government units in reestablishing the referral pathway and ensure functionality. As a result of our partnership with the government and NGOs and with the provision of technical assistance, the government has institutionalized the cluster approach and the protection cluster, including the CP and GBV within the DRRM mechanisms. Next slide, please. So the country setup may appear good in paper. We do have some good practices, but there are old, evolving, and new challenges that are emerging where the services should be closer to victim survivors. So at this point, I would like to focus on the bottlenecks encountered at the local level. So as former CP and GBV humanitarian coordinator, I was deployed in so many islands of the country wherein the typhoons struck. And I saw and heard from the communities themselves that challenges surrounding the timely access to and availability of quality information and services. Internet and communication lines doesn't work in those island barangays or even mountainous areas. Home visits are delayed whenever the weather is not good. Rescue operations cannot be immediately carried out. Transportation costs are quite high. So not all provinces have crisis centers or temporary shelters whenever a victim survivor would need support. No? The influx of information and services is hampered by the geographic separation of people and relying on mostly informal structures that may not be the most appropriate in handling the GBV, SEAH, and CP cases. And sad to say, politics impact on the prioritization and delivery of services and assistance. I remember a municipality during the time of high-end response wherein the mayor refused to hire a social worker even if there was a budget and job applicants. And whenever there was a victim survivor seeking assistance, she would be referred to the DSWD or to para-social workers. But on one hand, some mayors were supportive of prioritizing case management. They recruited deliberately or designated social workers focus only on case management. And I think that's one of the technical assistance that we have provided with the government for our social workers to focus on case management and not on relief distribution. Some localities, whenever the service providers do not talk to each other, we also encountered that sometimes social workers and female police officers do not talk to each other, and sometimes mayors will transfer our trained service providers, which disrupts the continuity of services, no? And there are also service providers, unfortunately, who prefer not to testify in court, so they refuse to perform some medical examinations, for example. So as humanitarian workers, as PSEA focal points, we do not just focus on the service providers, but we also do some advocacy work to ensure that these referral services are in place whenever we report or whenever we refer a victim survivor. And in communities with recognized leaders within the informal structures, the handling of cases of child protection, GBV, and SEAH are usually amicably settled and not reported. So in our attempt to make the CP and GBV referral pathway more child-friendly, more victim survivor centered, we included informal structures like the elderlies, the tribal leaders, the councils of the elders as entry points of assistance and support. Unfortunately, this led to cases being amicably settled. And this was a specific finding in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. And because of this, the Ministry of Social Services and Development refined the referral pathway and limited it to key service providers that are mandated by laws. So the new pathway was recently launched with guidelines, and we are hoping that they will be able to share with us, with the PSEA network. And they're also planning to have region-wide training for all service providers. And then another bottleneck that we have encountered is the limited protective mechanisms for the vulnerable groups such as persons with disability, low literacy, indigenous, and LGBTQI. And I think this boils down to the limited or lack of victim survivor-centered perspective of the service providers. So those with low education, for example, they do not have the confidence to approach service providers. So you have to support them, you have to assist them. Victim survivors placed in shelters are also bullied and re-abused by male personnel, which is unfortunate and which are also a not good experience. And the attitudes of service providers are discouraged, also discourage victim survivors from coming out. So when we did a study in ELRA, one of the LGBTQI respondents said that they have been ridiculed and abused or insulted when they approach the barangay captain, for example, or the police officer to report sexual molestation during the relief distribution. So this was, there was also this finding during the recent Odette response, Super Typhoon Rai response that hit the country in 2021, that one of the findings that we had is that we need to also build our capacities on how to address persons with disability. So these are some of the challenges that we have encountered in terms of providing services using the victim survivor-centered approach. However, next slide, please. There are ongoing efforts from the government to address the bottlenecks mentioned, but on the part of the PSEA network, we are collaborating and coordinating with the Child Protection Working Group and Gender-Based Violence Subcluster and government counterparts in making the reporting mechanisms and referral services work to create synergies and build trust, as in capital TRUST. We need to make sure that the system that we are putting in place are getting the trust of the communities, of our colleagues, and of the beneficiaries. We are in the process of finalizing the interagency SEAH referral procedures, and we are integrating the victim-centered approach, victim survivor-centered approach. There is also a task team putting together a PSEA refresher training module, which we hope to also incorporate this new approach. No, I mean, it is old, but for some, this is something that we still need to learn and to really look at it from the perspective of the victim survivor. We are also adopting the CP GBV referral pathway with guidelines. I remember the specific requests of our local service providers for Child Protection Working Group and GBV subcluster to unite and combine efforts instead of working separately. So at the regional level, there is the working joint CP and GBV subcluster, and the PSEA network is collaborating with them. And one of the good practices I've observed in some areas is the conduct of case conferences, and this is led by our local social workers. So the purpose is for the multidisciplinary team to come together and discuss the cases and come up with a plan. In some instances, they have invited the victim survivors along with their families if necessary, and they are also doing home visits as a follow-up and as a way of monitoring the cases under them. And then another lesson learned is the need to integrate family and peer support and spirituality into the delivery of the recovery and healing process, as this has been useful according to the victim survivors. So the ability to bounce back after traumatic experience is linked to the external and social support a victim survivor is getting around her. Some of those that I met said that the support she got from her family and friends was more helpful in her recovery rather than the services she availed from the government. And another least focused factors is spirituality, and victim survivors that I met were consistent in citing their personal relationship with God or a strong faith has helped them recover and see life positively. Such spiritual resilience is a source of strength that should be recognized as one of the assets of the individuals and of the communities. And then another lesson learned is the need to capacitate the non-protection actors and reporting and referring incidents, including the referral system and services from the victim survivor centered approach. A shift of perspective will make a lot of difference. When I was conducting a PSEA training with UNICEF CSO implementing partners on PSEA core standards, some of them were non-protection NGOs. We did role play using the yarn exercise. I'm not sure if you colleagues are familiar with that, but it was taken from the MISP, Minimum Initial Service Package for Sexual and Reproductive Health in Crisis training. So the exercise starts with the victim survivor and her choices on who to disclose and approach for help. There were a lot of aha moments, insights, and realizations and reflections on seeing things from the perspective of the victim survivor. It deepened their understanding on why a PSEA core standard is dedicated to assistance and services. However, I would like to emphasize that even the PSEA focal points of human agencies and NGOs need to be trained too. I know of a story where a PSEA focal point of an NGO was approached by a victim survivor of sexual abuse by a foreigner, and this happened right after their training and orientation on PSEA. And the NGO worker was approached 3 times. So first, it was some in-person approach, and then the next second round and the third one was through mobile hotline. And the NGO insisted on reporting to the police, while the victim survivor strongly was opposed to the idea until she stopped reaching out to that NGO. So it was a missed opportunity to provide the help she was seeking for. So we have a lot of things to catch up. Although we also have a lot of plans, and government is also doing their part, coordination and collaboration, not just with the cluster, but also with for example, with the gender and humanitarian action. So we have a lot on our plate for this year. And hopefully when we do the refresher training, we'll be able to build more capacities, not just for the PSEA focal points, but also for the humanitarian coordinators. So thank you so much.
Thanks
I
so
hope I
much,
have added
Cherie.
more
So-
insights into the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cherie. I love that you have an evidence base on your discussions as well, on your experiences, your many experiences within the country in your different roles, and also hearing from colleagues. And I also love that there is crossover in what you've come as and presented as your lessons learned, and also what Lucy has presented in the CHS paper as well. And we have Shamima, and my hugest apologies, Shamima, that I did not see you in the participants list, but please do come in. Shamima, over to you on your experiences in Bangladesh.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. This is Shamima. I work for Mukti Cox's Bazar as a project coordinator, victim-centered approach to PSEA project. Give me some time so that I can share my screen.
I'm sorry, just give me one moment, Shamima. We weren't aware you were going to produce some slides. Hold on one second. Okay, you should be able to now. Shamima, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm audible. You are audible. Give me some time.
Okay, in the meantime, while you're doing that, I want to encourage everyone to put any questions you have for our panel in the chat box. We have two questions in line, but if you have any questions for Martina, for Lucy, for Shamima, for Cherie, or even for Leanne and Irene, please feel free to pop them in the question. And also just to let you all know, we will send the PowerPoints and the recording to everyone after the webinar. And I'm about to try to put the yarn exercise attachment in the chat as well, because I have it written out. Okay, thanks, Shamima.
Thank you.
Your slides appeared, now they've disappeared. Would you like to go ahead and present without your slides if there's some difficulties? We only have 15 minutes left in the webinar.
Okay, sorry that I took time to start my presentation. So I'm really glad that I have got the opportunity to work on victim survivor-centered approach to PSEA. And for that, I would like to thank our donor, Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the Netherlands, and our technical partners, CHS Alliance. And one thing I want to share with you that I have newly joined to my organization, and it's been 20 days or so that I have been working for this project. So I have an immense pleasure to share our activities with all of you. Let's start with our slides. And our first slide is about our project. You can see that we have a project title, which is Provide Integrated Service to Establish Victim Survivor Center Approaches to PSEAH in Rohingya Camps and Host Community in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. Our implementing partner is Mukti Cox's Bazar. Our location is Cox's Bazar, and our implementing area is Ukhia Upazila under Cox's Bazar, Camp 4 and Camp 10. Our beneficiaries are a community member from Rohingya and host community. So as you know that while implementing a project, it's a common thing to face some challenges, and our challenges are like delayed need assessment approval from the government and related camp authority, a lack of cooperation from camp level protection sector at the beginning of the implementation phase, delayed volunteer recruitment, lack of training and meeting venue inside the camp area, lack of readily available skilled volunteers to conduct age and gender appropriate session on PSEA. Next slide, please. And there are some other challenges which are accessing the community, volunteer dropout, passive participation of community members in sessions. Next slide. So here we have I want to share that how we have solved those challenges. So the first challenges, we have conducted several meetings with the government authorities, RRRC and CIC. We explained them the necessity of our activities to implement victim-centered approach. And we also organized an inception meeting with them so that we can make them understand about our project goals and the benefit for the beneficiaries. After that, we also took some initiatives for the camp level protection sectors so that they can cooperate us. For example, for this we did regular basis communication with them. We seeking assistance, involving them in decision making, and we tried to rapport build with them. For the delayed volunteer recruitment, as you know, I have said that we have delayed need assessment approval. For that, we had to go for volunteer recruitment, and we engaged all the authorities during our recruitment procedures and collaborated with Mukti GBV team for experienced volunteer. Already Mukti is working at camp level, so we collaborated them for experienced volunteers. For a lack of training and meetings venue inside the camp area, we tried to go for alternatives way, and like arranging alternatives venue, utilizing Mukti's facilities at camp level, convincing community leaders to use their residence or so that they can help us by their place. A lack of readily available skilled volunteers to conduct age and gender appropriate session on PSEA. We provide coaching and mentoring session to our volunteers so that they can have knowledge on PSEAH and victim-centered approach. We also provide some hand notes on age and gender appropriate content so that they can provide sessions separately to the children, adolescent, or to the elderly people. Organizing pre-activities for community session. Actually, we prepare our volunteers before conducting any session at community level so that they can provide information and actually, in the beginning, while we were conducting a session with community people on PSEAH and victim-centered approach, at first they didn't like to talk too much or didn't want active participation. It's happened at the beginning, and for that we tried to building trust between community member and volunteers, national and international staff, arranging some energizer sessions so that participants feel comfortable and enthusiastic. Next slide. Volunteer and staff dropout. It's an ongoing challenge actually. So we waiting list and headhunting procedure and collaboration with GBV volunteers, so that we may replace another expert volunteers in our project. Okay. Now now I'm going to discuss about how Mukti is implementing PSEA and involvement of the community. But for this part, I want to share one thing, that in 2021 there was a research was conducted, a practical action research was conducted, and it was found that total complaint against SEAH was found that 70% was informal complaint and 30% was formal complaint organization received. So from this situation and recommendation from the community level, Mukti is implementing victim-centered approaches in this way. Like for disclosure, we provide awareness session on humanitarian code of conduct and formal and informal reporting mechanism. For this, we engage community people, adolescents, children, and other stakeholders, so that they can report and they understand the importance of reporting on ACA incidents.
Shamika, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we only have 5 minutes left in the webinar. And there was an important question that came through the chat that we wanted an opportunity for the participants to add. So I'm very sorry, but we'll make sure that if you can send your slides to us, we'll make sure that everyone at the webinar gets a copy of them afterwards. So Irene, do you want to lead the question?
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Shamima, and thanks to all the presenters for today, Cherie, Lucy, thank you. And of course, Martina. So we have 2 questions online that came up. So I'll read out the first one. From Chonia Cho. I'm sorry, I will butcher the name, so I will not attempt to do it. How do you manage between mandatory reporting and survivor consent? I think this was for Lucy.
I'm happy to take that one, Irene.
Thanks.
Yes. Yeah. So as you'll know, many organizations, I think particularly the UN organizations, it is mandatory for staff to report any SEA issues that they become aware of. And I think this probably stems from the 6 core principles of PSEA, one of which is that staff are obliged to report any SEA concerns. However, this means that we find ourselves in a position where if somebody does start to disclose to us, for staff of those agencies, they're required to say, no, hang on, wait, I do need to tell you that I do need to report anything that you disclose to me. I think that it will be useful for organizations to rethink their approach on this a little bit, because what we're actually doing is making a very sort of intimidating and hostile environment for people to feel that they want to disclose. And I can see that the reasons for having mandatory reporting, of course, is because there were so many staff who heard about rumors or found out about SEA and did not refer it to the organization, therefore it didn't get addressed. So it's obviously incredibly important, but I think it needs to be a bit more nuanced. So what I usually say is, if the organisation is acceptable with this approach, that staff are able to receive a disclosure and then in confidence speak to their PSEA advisor, safeguarding advisor, GBV advisor, without giving any of the confidential information, and say how to get them to talk through how they could perhaps then reapproach the survivor gently and carefully, and not pushing them to give any information or to consent to it being taken up, and to keep up that dialogue with the survivor. And I think, you know, SEA is a removal of consent. So it's incredibly important that we focus on consent when we're dealing with disclosures. So I think if a survivor does not consent for their information to be shared, then we would need to respect that. But I think it needs to be a lot more nuanced.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Quick answer for a complicated question.
Thank you. I know. We also always get it, even under gender-based violence.
I'll take this as an opportunity to let you know that in May or June, we're going to be having a webinar specifically on mandatory reporting and gender-based violence on the community of practice. So if you do join the community of practice, you will get an announcement about that. So we hope that you will think about it. Thanks, Irene.
Thanks, Sarah. So next, I have another one from Leah, a victim survivor-centered approach. Victim survivor-centered approach is often confused by investigators with a process of being victim-led, thus potentially compromising the principles of due process. How are you countering this narrative? I guess anyone from the presenters can come in.
I can answer that one, but I wanted to give somebody else the opportunity if they wanted to take that one.
Go ahead, Lucy.
Yes.
Yeah, the participant is absolutely right. There is a difference between being victim survivor led and victim survivor focused. And actually, we can't, when the perpetrator is our member of staff, we can't always be victim led. Because what the victim survivor wants us to do might be contrary with our own internal procedures, and most importantly, the fact that we're accountable for that staff member. So there are certain procedures that we need to undergo to make sure that you know, there are disciplinary outcomes for that staff member, and that that staff member is removed from any situations where there might be a continued risk to people they come into contact with. So again, that can be sort of quite a difficult pathway to navigate. But I think as long as we're upfront that we cannot always be victim survivor led in dealing with these situations, then we need to work out how we navigate that. Yeah, well, on the one hand, putting the victim survivor at the heart of what we do, but also making sure that we're accountable for that perpetrator who presents a risk to people they come into contact with.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Thanks, Lucy. Anyone else from the presenters or organizer?
Yeah, it's Martina. Just to complement what Lucy was saying, which I think is as well, I think everybody is approaching this. Obviously, there's a serious allegation, and then there's internal rule work of the organization. I think it's a lot about setting expectations. In the end, the investigation, when it's an administrative investigation, sets to see where there has been breaches in administrative procedures and when those behaviors have been unethical. So we're guided by that. And I do think that victim-centered approach is also an approach. So it's also the way of how you communicate in quite intimidating thing. And I think it's really important for a survivor to be heard, to hear that they're being taken seriously, and then with all the sort of limitations that an internal administrative process might or might not be. So I think it's about navigating that process so that there is a sense of outcome. But of course, to your point, Leah, there, I think that it's also clear that it is a sort of sense of being innocent until proven guilty, so to speak. So it is obviously sort of weighing exculpatory and inculpatory evidence and what can be proven to have that sort of to substantiate the allegation and then achieve that redress through the organization.
Thanks, Martina. I have few more questions online, but I can also see Nadia raising her hand. I have
and
two.
Also at time, just to let you know.
I don't know. I'll ask one or two more questions for people who can stay. I don't know about the organizers, if they can spare a bit of time, 10 minutes max, just to answer some of the questions. Is that okay? I'll go ahead and let's see. So there's a question on investigation. Trainings here are limited. Are there any platforms or funds available to apply on these trainings? I'm looking at Leanne on that question.
For that, it's difficult. So I think we were not able to raise any funds for it at the regional level. Unfortunately, it has to be done at the country level. So I think there are ways to do it. You will need to have evidence that there is a need for it, and then approach the donors to fund. We were able to do this in Myanmar to create a pool of investigators, but not great outcomes, to be honest. You can see the lessons learned paper on the regional share drive, and you can go to that drive, access that on the regional AAP PSEA working group webpage. But I will be quiet for other colleagues to come in. I know there's opportunities through the CHS Alliance, and perhaps Lucy can come in. Thanks.
Yeah, I can mention the CHS Alliance Investigator Qualification Training Scheme. However, that is not cost-free, unfortunately. I believe that there are discounts available for smaller and less resourced organisations. But although I'm involved in it and I'm one of the facilitators, I don't know much about that side of it. I will pop a link in the chat if people would like more information on that scheme.
Thank you so much. I will ask, I'll give the floor to Nadia. Thanks, Nadia. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay. Apologies that I joined a bit late. I think it's quite relevant to ask this question, so I will take the opportunity. So my question is, I'm Nadia. I work for PUMI, Premier Urgence International. It's a health-based organization, and I'm working as protection advisor. My question is, what could be a possible approach on organizations should take in terms of especially for a health organization, in terms of sexual violence or misconduct is done, especially the case of rape, for example, clinical management of rape, right? So what could be an approach for an organization like health organization? What are the resources we should have within the health sector that when we receive or get exposed with any sort of rape cases, what are the resources the organization will require to have that will support in terms of capacity building of health facility staff to know how to deal with such kind of cases in safe and in confidential manner. At the same time, what are the action could be helpful for those victims, especially for the health organization like us. I would love to hear from some of you if you have any idea, because we are also working on these ideas, how we can develop some resources within the organization to focus on capacity building, because at the same time, we don't do case management or we don't have direct protection standalone project to sort of refer this kind of cases. If this kind of cases come, how us as a health organization approach? Over to you all.
Thank you, Nadia. Anyone who wants to come in for that question? Personally, I would suggest to come into the working groups if you have them in your specific area of work. Most of the colleagues who work specifically for example, on PSEA or GBV, come there, and that's the whole purpose of having a working group, to have shared resources on them. I have worked in this role in another region in Ukraine actually, and one of the things that we were tapping were the resources and guidelines from WHO. They do have good guidelines on it as well, especially on health services. But I would also say gender-based violence working group subclusters in your specific area of work, even PSEA, just connect And as mentioned by Lucy a while ago, it's important to map out resources, but also allies and partners. No, I always say this with PSEA, you cannot. It's a shared risk. Therefore, it's a shared responsibility, especially to the humanitarian sector. I'll stop here. I am very sorry. I do not have much time. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you to all the presenters for taking the time. I know for most it's quite early, for Lucy, for Sarah, and of course Martina and Leanne. Thank you very much. All the best to your next mission, next role, Sarah. Our deepest thanks for helping us out in this webinar. We will be sending out our recording as well as the slides for this session. That's it from me. I don't know if anyone wants to come in to say thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Irene, for responding. I'll definitely check as per your advice with the regional clusters. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much to our panelists.
Thanks,
It was
everyone.
really enriching to hear from everyone. Thanks so much, Sarah, for helping us organize this. And I think it was a great cross collaboration of colleagues at the regional level.
Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.